You're heavy. You're ugly. You're a freak." Pearl stood frozen like a statue. Her mother stepped closer, stiletto heels clicking against the hardwood floor, each step like a countdown to execution. "Nobody wants you, so you're going to marry the man who can no longer walk." Her father sat hunched in the corner, face buried in his hands, fingers clutching each other in helpless silence. Her sister stood by the window, sunlight gleaming off her golden hair, lips curled into the triumphant smile of someone who had just escaped a death sentence. And Pearl, 27 years old, realized her fate had just been sealed. She was about to become the wife of Jericho Crane. That name made all of Las Vegas tremble. The most powerful mafia boss in Sin City. A man who once commanded an empire from the shadows. A man who had been confined to a wheelchair for 14 months, ever since his enemies planted a bomb beneath his car. The same man her sister had been engaged to, then abandoned without a backward glance the moment he could no longer stand on his own 2 feet. Now Pearl had become the replacement. A discarded daughter traded for a powerful alliance. But there was something her family didn't know. Pearl possessed an ability that no one believed. She could see the colors of sound. Every word, every breath, every heartbeat appeared before her eyes as vivid streaks of color. Lies were black as tar. Truth shimmered blue like jade. Hatred burned crimson like dried blood. And her mother's voice right now? Black. An abyssal darkness like a bottomless pit. The void of a moonless, starless night. Pearl had seen that black for 27 years. She thought it was the only color the world had for her until she met him. The man the whole world had abandoned. The man sitting alone in a darkened room, refusing to face anyone. His voice was completely different, and what Pearl saw within it would change both their lives forever. But before she could uncover the truth behind his darkness, she had to survive the nightmare of her forced vows. 3 days later, Pearl stood before the massive oak doors that opened into the penthouse level of the Crane Casino. The white wedding dress her mother had chosen clung tightly to her full figure. The seams at the waist strained every time she took a deep breath. Constance Whitmore had deliberately chosen a gown 2 sizes too small, like one final cruel reminder that Pearl did not deserve anything in this life that actually fit. Knox Mercer, the chief bodyguard of the Crane family, pushed the heavy doors open and motioned for her to step inside. His face held no expression, but Pearl noticed that his clipped voice carried a pale gray color. Neutral, neither cruel nor kind. The penthouse room was shrouded in heavy darkness. Black velvet curtains had been drawn tightly shut, completely blocking out the harsh Las Vegas sunlight. Only a few dim lamps gave off a murky yellow glow like candles burned halfway down. The air was cold enough to raise goosebumps on Pearl's bare skin, and the faint scent of old wood and bitter whiskey lingered heavily in the room. And in the center of it all, with its back to the door, a matte black wheelchair stood motionless like a statue. The man sitting in it did not bother to turn around. Eleanor Crane stood beside her son, her platinum hair cut into a sharp bob, her steel gray eyes sweeping over Pearl from head to toe. She said nothing, but that cold, calculating look alone was enough for Pearl to understand that she was being measured and weighed like cheap merchandise on a shelf. Jericho still did not turn around. He was speaking with a man in a gray suit, a lawyer holding a stack of legal papers. His voice echoed low and dull in the silent room. Does she know how to sign her name? Or do I need to prepare a stamp? And Pearl heard the color. A muddy gray. Not the pitch black of cruelty. Not the crimson red of rage. It was a muddy gray like dense fog, like stale cigarette smoke dissolving into the freezing air, like a soul slowly sinking into absolute nothingness without any strength left to struggle. Pearl watched that dreary streak of color drift through the chilly air, and suddenly she understood everything. This feared mafia boss was not angry. He was dying from the inside out. Before she could stop herself, the words slipped past her lips. Your voice is muddy gray, like someone who has locked himself inside a room with no windows. The entire room froze. The lawyer stopped turning the pages. Eleanor frowned sharply. Behind her, Knox drew in a very quiet breath. And Jericho Crane, for the first time in 14 months, stopped everything because of someone else's words. The electric wheelchair turned slowly around. Pearl saw his face for the very first time. Sharp, severe, with high cheekbones hollowed out by severe weight loss, and storm gray eyes that fixed on her without blinking. A faint scar ran from his temple down to his left cheek like a crack across a forgotten stone statue. He must have been breathtakingly handsome once, Pearl thought. The kind of dangerous, magnetic beauty that made people want to come closer and run away at the exact same time. But now that beauty had been worn down by excruciating pain into something far more ruined. "Who are you?" Jericho asked, his voice incredibly low and slow. Pearl answered without lowering her gaze, holding her head high despite the suffocating dress. "The woman you are about to marry, even though you do not want to." Absolute silence filled the dark room. Eleanor was about to speak, to scold this insolent girl, but Jericho lifted a single hand to stop his mother. He looked at Pearl for a few more endless seconds, his dark gray eyes deepening as though trying desperately to read something hidden in her face. Then he turned his wheelchair back toward the heavy oak table, his voice as cold as ice. "Begin. I do not have all day." The ceremony was over in less than 10 minutes. There was no music. There were no flowers. There were no wedding rings because Eleanor said they would be prepared later, though Pearl knew the matriarch had absolutely no intention of preparing anything at all. The lawyer read from dry, lifeless legal documents. Pearl signed her name with a trembling hand. Jericho signed his without even looking at the paper. And that was it. Pearl Whitmore became Pearl Crane in a freezing dark room, standing in front of people who did not want her there. Jericho turned his wheelchair and left the exact moment he had signed the final paper, rolling away without another word, without looking back even once. Eleanor followed her son like a shadow, leaving Pearl standing completely alone in the middle of the empty room as the lawyer gathered his papers and Knox waited silently by the door. Pearl watched Jericho's broad shoulders disappear beyond the doorway, and she saw that sad, muddy gray trail following him like the dying tail of a falling star. That same night, Pearl was transported in absolute silence to the Crane estate. The modern mansion stood on a steep hill overlooking the neon pulse of Las Vegas, constructed entirely of cold glass and unforgiving steel, gleaming like an impenetrable fortress in the desolate desert. The security was even tighter than at the casino. Cameras tracked her every movement from the shadowed corners, and heavily armed guards patrolled the perimeter all night long, their footsteps heavy against the paved walkways. Pearl was led by a silent escort into the master bedroom. It was a cavernous space, a room as large as the entire attic floor where she had once been hidden away by her mother. A massive bed sat in the center, draped in pristine, icy white silk sheets that looked as though they had never been slept in. A glittering crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, and a massive closet gaped open, bigger than her old bedroom. Yet it was cold. Cold clear down into her brittle bones, even though the central heating was running quietly in the background. Jericho never appeared. He did not come to claim his bride or even to offer a word of greeting. Nina Santos, the head housekeeper of the estate, a petite woman with warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, was the only person who spoke to Pearl that entire evening. Nina brought in a tray of warm food and gently explained that the master had not left his private room since the terrible accident 14 months ago. "You should not feel hurt by his absence, miss. Everything will eventually get better," Nina said. Nina's voice manifested as a soft pale blue in Pearl's eyes, the undeniable color of absolute sincerity with no selfishness hidden within it. Pearl thanked the housekeeper softly and said she was not hurt at all. It was the honest truth. She had gotten completely used to being abandoned a very long time ago, packing away her expectations until her heart was a quiet, empty box. At midnight, Pearl found that she could not sleep. The massive room was far too large, the silence too oppressive, and the silk sheets too unfamiliar against her skin. She slipped out of bed, wrapped herself tightly in the thin cotton robe Nina had left for her, and began wandering barefoot through the sprawling estate. The grand hallway stretched endlessly before her, lined with absurdly expensive oil paintings and cold marble sculptures that watched her like silent judges. Pearl passed the vast living room, the formal dining room, and the towering library, all of them completely dark and profoundly empty, resembling a forgotten museum long after closing hours. She kept walking until the polished marble turned to dull hardwood beneath her toes. Then she reached the very end of the eastern hallway. Here, she found an old wooden door, looking much older than any of the others in the modern house. The dark paint was chipped slightly at the bottom corners, and the heavy brass lock was coated in a thin layer of rust. It was the only door that looked as though it had not been opened in a very long time. Pearl stepped closer and pressed her ear against the coal wood. She heard it very faintly. Something was coming from inside. It sounded like wind, like a heavy sigh, like the tragic sound of a room desperately waiting for someone to finally come back. Pearl retreated to her bedroom, returning a few minutes later with a small metal hairpin she had found on the vanity. She had taught herself how to pick locks from watching online videos during those painful years trapped in her attic room, specifically when her cruel mother locked the door so her awkward daughter would not disturb her sister's glamorous parties. The old, rusted lock gave way after just a few minutes of careful maneuvering. The heavy wooden door creaked open, the sound like time itself groaning in protest. Pearl stepped carefully inside. The room was buried in heavy darkness and the smell of ancient dust. Pale moonlight slipped gracefully through a tall window covered by sheer, moth-eaten curtains, falling directly over a massive, draped shape situated right in the middle of the floor. Pearl walked closer, her breath catching in her throat, and slowly pulled away the heavy canvas dust cover. A magnificent black Steinway grand piano emerged from the shadows. A thick layer of gray dust covered the polished lid, but the elegant body of the timeless instrument was still completely intact, still breathtakingly beautiful, resembling a sleeping beauty in the dark woods just waiting to be awakened. Pearl reached out, her hand shaking slightly. Her fingers trembled as the icy white ivory key met her warm skin. She pressed down. A single, pure note rang out into the silent, dusty room. In Pearl's eyes, a magnificent color suddenly exploded. Gold. Brilliant, pure gold. It was as warm and radiant as the first light of a beautiful summer morning. For the first time in many long, suffocating years, Pearl actually saw that bright color. She pulled up the heavy wooden bench and sat down, letting the magic wash over her. Her fingers found the keys entirely on their own. The music poured out into the stale air like a rushing river finally breaking through a heavy stone dam. Pearl played and played, completely forgetting the terrifying passage of time, forgetting the unfamiliar shadows of the dusty room, forgetting the suffocating forced marriage to a paralyzed mafia boss, forgetting absolutely everything except the breathtaking music and the brilliant golden light flooding the physical space around her. She closed her eyes, letting the melody guide her bruised soul. Each chord struck a different hue in her mind's eye. Warm honey gold blended seamlessly with flashes of bright turquoise and the softest, most fragile shades of violet. For 27 years, her cruel mother had strictly forbidden her from touching any instrument, claiming her clumsy hands would only produce grating noise. But right now, Pearl was weaving pure magic from the forgotten silence. She did not know that the massive estate was heavily wired with hidden microphones. She did not know that the advanced camera system mounted in the far corner of the ceiling was recording her every breath, her every graceful sway, her every tear that slipped down her cheek as the music swelled. And she certainly did not know that on the completely opposite side of the sprawling fortress, in a heavily secured room in the western wing, Jericho Crane was sitting alone before a glowing wall of surveillance screens. The room was pitch black except for the cold bluish light radiating from the dozens of monitors. Jericho sat motionless in his matte black wheelchair, a half-empty glass of expensive whiskey resting on the small table beside him. For 14 agonizing months, his nightly routine had consisted of staring blankly at the security feeds, watching his silent, heavily armed guards patrol the perimeter, waiting for a dawn that meant absolutely nothing to him. His face had been frozen in a mask of bitter indifference ever since the devastating car bomb stole his legs and his formidable empire. But tonight, that mask suddenly slipped. The moment the first pure piano note filtered through the high-quality audio speakers, Jericho flinched. He stared intensely at the screen showing the dusty, abandoned music room. He watched the stranger he had married just hours ago, a woman his own mother had discarded as a useless pawn, sitting at the old Steinway. Her eyes were closed, her head thrown back slightly, her heavy white cotton robe glowing like a bright beacon in the dim moonlight. The melody she played was incredibly complex, filled with a deep, aching sorrow that perfectly mirrored the muddy gray abyss inside his own chest, yet it possessed an undeniable, shimmering thread of fierce hope. It was a desperate cry for freedom from a cage he understood all too well. Jericho leaned forward, his large hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly his scarred knuckles turned stark white. For the very first time in 14 months, a strange tightness gripped his throat that had absolutely nothing to do with physical pain or suppressed rage. The beautiful music wrapped tightly around him, seeping into the dark, frozen corners of his mind where he had locked away his humanity. Just then, the heavy steel door to his sanctuary opened with a soft click. Knox Mercer stepped quietly into the room. The chief bodyguard glanced at the surveillance screen, taking in the unexpected sight of the new bride playing the piano, then looked directly down at his employer. Knox's face remained carefully blank, but his voice betrayed a faint edge of uncertainty. "Do you want me to stop her, sir?" The silence in the dark room stretched on for several heavy seconds, filled only by the hauntingly beautiful piano music drifting perfectly from the audio speakers. Jericho did not pull his gaze away from the monitor. He watched Pearl's delicate hands fly effortlessly across the keys, struck by the profound contrast between her gentle touch and the brutal, unforgiving world she had just been shoved into. Then Jericho answered, his voice significantly lower and softer than its usual harsh, gravelly rasp. "No, let her play." Knox looked at his employer, entirely unable to hide his genuine shock. For 14 brutal months, Jericho Crane had not cared about anything at all. Not the lucrative casino business, not his backstabbing family, not even his own life or death. He had only sat in the suffocating dark and waited for useless time to pass. But tonight, for the very first time, something had finally made the feared Mafia boss pause. Something had made him actually listen. Jericho stared intently at the screen, entirely captivated by the strange, unwanted woman pouring her broken heart into the dusty instrument. And he did not understand why the sound of her music made the heavy darkness inside his ruined chest feel just a little bit lighter. From that night onward, a silent, secret ritual was born. Jericho began watching the security cameras every single time Pearl entered the forgotten room. He did not tell Knox, and he certainly did not tell his manipulative mother. He did not fully understand why he felt this sudden, desperate pull toward her midnight sessions. He only knew that her golden music was the absolute only thing that made his agonizingly long, sleepless nights a little less dark. It was the first breath of real life he had taken since the blast, and he realized with a quiet, terrifying certainty that he was already becoming completely addicted to the beautiful sound of his invisible wife. On the 5th morning after the bleak wedding, Nina Santos came to the master bedroom. Her warm face carried a heavy trace of worry as she softly announced that Madame wished to see Pearl in the Western study. Pearl nodded slowly, not asking why and not showing any fear. She had spent 27 miserable years under her own mother's cruel roof, completely used to being summoned only to hear sharp insults or cold commands. Eleanor Crane might have been infinitely more powerful and far more dangerous, but in her dark essence, she was not all that different. Eleanor's private study was located on the second floor at the very end of the sprawling western hallway. It was an intimidating room filled with heavy, valuable mahogany furniture and deep red velvet curtains that muted the harsh morning light. The suffocating scent of expensive perfume mingled with the raw smell of old leather from the armchairs. Eleanor sat rigidly behind a massive black oak desk, her back perfectly straight, her piercing steel gray eyes fixing on Pearl the exact moment she entered. She did not invite Pearl to sit down. Pearl did not ask. She simply stood in front of the desk, her arms hanging loosely at her sides, waiting in absolute silence. Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, her manicured fingers tapping a slow, calculating rhythm on the polished desktop. Then she opened a deep drawer and calmly placed a lethal black handgun directly on the desk. She did not point it at Pearl. She simply set it there, the dark barrel angled to one side, the glossy metal looking painfully cold beneath the yellow lamplight. Pearl looked down at the weapon. She did not step back, she did not draw in a frightened breath, and she certainly did not tremble. She only observed it blankly, as though it were an ordinary paperweight. Eleanor watched Pearl's remarkably calm reaction, one corner of her sharp mouth lifting in a predatory smirk. This is how we remind people of power. You do not need to be afraid. You only need to understand. Pearl gave a small nod. I understand. In Pearl's eyes, Eleanor's voice manifested as the absolute color of steel gray. Not the pitch-black void of her mother, not the bruised crimson of pure hatred, but a sterile steel gray. Cold, hyper-calculating, and entirely without human emotion. It was the absolute color of someone who saw human beings as disposable pieces on a chessboard, neither hating nor loving them, only using them and discarding them when necessary. Eleanor went straight to the harsh point. You are here in this house for one reason only, to give the Crane family a child. Pearl was not surprised. She had guessed as much from the very first day she was traded like livestock. Jericho was the absolute only heir to the massive Crane empire. After his devastating accident, his future had become dangerously uncertain. Eleanor desperately needed a grandchild to make absolutely sure the powerful bloodline continued. I will give you exactly 6 months, Eleanor stated, her voice sounding as though she were reading out a dry business contract. 6 months to get pregnant. After that, you will be treated very well. You will live wrapped in absolute luxury. You will enjoy absolutely everything vast amounts of money can buy. She paused, her gray eyes staring straight into Pearl's soul. But if there are 0 results after 6 months, your weak father will have problems, a great many fatal problems. Pearl understood exactly what the matriarch meant. Her father, weak and powerless though he was still the only person who had ever truly loved her. Eleanor was ruthlessly using him as a hostage to force her into total submission. It was a familiar, dirty tactic. Eleanor leaned back in her expensive leather chair, waiting for the inevitable surrender. But Pearl did not lower her head. She looked straight into Eleanor's eyes and spoke in a perfectly calm voice, as though they were merely discussing the desert weather. I cannot do that. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the study. Eleanor blinked for the very first time, showing genuine surprise since Pearl had walked into the room. What did you say? Eleanor demanded. I cannot do what you are asking, Pearl answered softly. It is not that I do not want to, it is that I physically cannot. Eleanor frowned deeply, her gray eyes darkening with rising anger. Are you refusing me? Pearl drew in a slow breath, gathering her scattered thoughts before she explained her hidden truth. I have a very special condition. When someone touches me without any real affection, I hear horrible sounds, like broken glass shattering violently inside my head. It hurts very badly. Eleanor fell entirely silent, her eyes narrowing suspiciously as though she were trying to decide whether Pearl was lying to save herself or telling the absolute truth. Pearl continued, her voice never wavering. "If your son and I do that without genuine love, every single time he touches me, I will hear sharp glass breaking over and over without ever stopping." She paused, letting the heavy words sink into the quiet room. "I will go insane, quite literally. And a woman who is completely insane cannot carry a healthy child or raise one." Eleanor looked at Pearl with a completely different expression. Not contempt, not false pity, but intense curiosity. The specific kind of curiosity a predator showed when it encountered a strange, unyielding creature for the very first time. "You are saying you're insane?" Eleanor asked. "No," Pearl answered clearly. "I am only different from other people, just as your son is different after his terrible accident." The tense atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. Eleanor said nothing for a very long while, her fingers still tapping on the desk, but the rhythm had slowed significantly, as though she were thinking very deeply about her next move. Then the older woman stood, picked up the lethal weapon from the desk, and placed it safely back in the dark drawer. 6 months, Eleanor finally said, her voice still cold but carrying something entirely new. "I will give you exactly 6 months to solve your little problem. How you do it is entirely up to you." Pearl nodded politely and turned to leave the suffocating room. Just as her hand touched the cold brass doorknob, Eleanor's voice echoed from behind her. "And Pearl, the next time I summon you, you should remember to knock before entering." Pearl did not turn around. She opened the heavy door and stepped out, closing it gently behind her. Eleanor remained entirely alone in the dark study, looking at the closed door, her lips moving softly in the silence. "This invisible girl is not as simple as I thought." On the 10th night after the suffocating wedding, Pearl was sitting at the Grand Steinway exactly as she had every single night before. Pale moonlight slipped gracefully through the narrow gap in the sheer curtains, falling across the stark black and white keys like a miniature galaxy trapped in the dusty room. She was playing a very slow, melancholic piece, the heavy notes dropping into the absolute stillness like cold rain in the dead of winter, when the heavy wooden door suddenly creaked open. Pearl stopped playing instantly, her hands freezing above the keys, and turned her head. Jericho Crane sat in his matte black wheelchair right in the doorway, one large hand resting heavily on the control stick, his storm gray eyes fixed on her without a single blink. He had pushed himself all the way here, with absolutely no knocks and no loyal bodyguards waiting beside him. For the very first time since the bleak wedding ceremony, they were completely alone together in the exact same room. Pearl did not say anything. She only looked at his sharp, ruined face and waited in the heavy silence. Jericho said nothing either, his piercing gaze drifting slowly over the dusty room, the majestic grand piano, and then finally returning to her face. The tense silence stretched on for so long that Pearl could vividly hear the rapid beat of her own heart echoing in her ears. Then Jericho finally spoke, his voice incredibly low and rough, sounding as though it had been far too long since he had spoken to anyone as an equal. "What exactly do you see when you hear me speak?" Pearl was not entirely surprised by the sudden question. Perhaps he had somehow overheard her tense conversation with his mother, or perhaps he was simply curious about the strange words she had spoken on their wedding day. Either way, she had absolutely no reason to lie to him. "Muddy gray," she answered with absolute honesty. "It looks like thick fog, like stale cigarette smoke dissolving into freezing air. You are sinking deep into something I do not know the name of." Jericho let out a short, bitter laugh that broke sharply through the still room. "Sinking," he repeated slowly, his voice carrying the harsh taste of bitter whiskey and endless regret. "I died 14 months ago, Pearl. This broken body just has not stopped breathing quite yet." Pearl looked at him, truly looked at the muddy gray drifting thickly around his broad shoulders like a heavy layer of fog that stubbornly refused to disappear. She did not offer the empty, polite comfort people always gave, the useless lies that things would magically get better or that he would eventually make it through. She had heard far too many hollow words like that in her own miserable life, and she knew exactly how entirely meaningless they could be. Instead, she chose to say exactly what she truly saw. There is a very small streak of another color hiding inside your voice, buried deep down inside, almost completely hidden by the heavy gray. I cannot see it clearly yet. Jericho fell perfectly silent, his intense gray eyes fixed on her with something Pearl could not quite read. "What color?" he asked, his voice significantly lower now, practically a whisper in the dark. "I do not know yet," Pearl said truthfully. "It is far too small, but it is definitely still there. You have not died completely the way you think you have." No one had ever dared to speak to Jericho Crane like that. For 14 grueling months, people had either looked at him with sickening pity, avoided him out of sheer terror, or desperately tried to fix him as though he were a defective object that simply needed its broken parts replaced. But Pearl did absolutely none of those things. She simply saw him, said exactly what she saw, and demanded absolutely nothing from him in return. Jericho looked at her for a very long moment, taking in her oversized cotton robe and her bare feet, then asked another question. "Why do you only play at night?" Pearl turned her gaze back toward the grand piano, her slender fingers brushing lightly across the cold keys, without actually pressing them down. "Because during the day, I am not allowed to. My mother always said my piano sounded like an animal dying in pain. She strictly forbade me to play from the time I was 14 years old." Jericho said absolutely nothing, but his gray eyes darkened violently. He understood that agonizing feeling perfectly. Having the absolute only thing you loved brutally taken away. Being strictly forbidden the very things that made you feel alive. Before the devastating accident, he could go anywhere and do absolutely anything he desired. Now, even pushing his wheelchair from his dark bedroom to this dusty room left him short of breath and aching. "Play," he finally said, his rough voice far gentler than before. "I will never forbid you." Pearl looked at him for a quiet moment, feeling a strange warmth bloom in her chest, then turned back to the beautiful piano. She began to play again, and the complex notes immediately flooded the room. Brilliant gold exploded in her eyes, brighter than it had ever been. Jericho did not leave. He sat there in the heavy dark and listened to her play until the first pale light of dawn slipped softly through the curtains. He said nothing more. He was simply there. And Pearl, for the very first time in 27 years, did not feel completely alone while she played. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Nina Santos quietly assured her that no one would disturb her, Pearl sat by the massive window of her bedroom and initiated a secure video call to her father. Gerald Whitmore appeared on the glowing screen of her phone. His familiar face was significantly thinner than the last time she had seen him. His gray-blue eyes, the exact same shade as hers, were weighed down by deep, dark circles. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt, his silver hair untidy, and Pearl instantly recognized the background. He was hiding in the small back office of his failing music shop, the absolute only place where he could safely escape Constance's crushing tyranny. "Are you all right, Pearl?" Gerald asked immediately, his strained voice filled with frantic worry. "Are they treating you well? Is anyone giving you trouble?" Pearl smiled faintly, tracing the edge of her phone. "I am all right, Father. No one is giving me trouble." In her own eyes, her spoken words manifested as a soft pale blue. It was not a complete lie, but it was not the absolute truth either. She was not all right in the ordinary sense, but she had lived so long without being all right that the dull ache had become comfortably familiar. Gerald looked at his daughter through the digital screen, and something heavy flickered in his tired eyes that Pearl could not quite read. Then he spoke again, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as though he were terribly afraid someone might overhear them. "Pearl, there is something I desperately need to tell you. Something I have kept completely hidden." Pearl froze, her heart skipping a painful beat. "What is it?" Gerald swallowed hard. Every single time you played in secret at night, I recorded it," he confessed, his voice trembling with years of suppressed emotion. "For the past 10 years, I secretly recorded your beautiful piano music. I sent those audio tapes to music producers, to prestigious academies, to absolutely anyone who might have helped you find another road. I wanted you to have a safe way out. Do you understand? Even though your mother would never allow it, even though she strictly forbade you to ever touch the piano, I still wanted you to have a real chance." Hot tears instantly spilled down Pearl's pale cheeks. She could not stop them, and she did not want to. For 27 agonizing years in that suffocating house, she had truly believed that absolutely no one saw her. She thought no one cared about what she loved or what she might have been capable of achieving. But her father had seen her. Her quiet, defeated father had quietly gathered every single small fragment of hope for her over 10 long years without saying a single word. In Pearl's eyes, Gerald's voice was pure, brilliant turquoise. It was the undeniable color of unconditional love, the vibrant shade of silent sacrifice, the very color she had so rarely been allowed to witness in her miserable life. "Do not let anyone put out your music, do you hear me?" Gerald pleaded, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. "Not even me. Not your mother. And definitely not that Mafia husband of yours. Do not let absolutely anyone take away what rightfully belongs to you." Pearl nodded rapidly, wiping the wet tears running down her face. "I hear you, father. I promise." Gerald drew in a deep, shaky breath, sitting up a little straighter. "I will find a safe way to come see you. I promise you that. This time, I will not stay silent anymore." Pearl felt a sharp spike of terror for him. "Do not do anything that will make Mother angry," she urged, worrying far more for his safety than for her own. "I have stayed completely silent for 27 years, Gerald answered, his voice suddenly firmer and more resolute than she had ever heard it in her entire life. "That is enough." The emotional call ended shortly after, leaving Pearl sitting completely alone in the massive room, the wet tears still cooling on her cheeks. She thought deeply about her father, about 10 years of secretly recording her music, about the profound love. He had never spoken aloud, but had always shown through his quiet, persistent actions. Her long-lost dream of playing professionally, a dream Constance had brutally crushed, suddenly sparked back to life like a dying ember catching the wind. That night, Pearl went down to the dusty music room and played the Grand Steinway with fresh tears on her face. The complex notes rose sad and breathtakingly beautiful, falling into the heavy stillness like cold rain on a metal roof in the dead of winter, sounding exactly like the whisper of ambitious dreams buried entirely too long ago. Far across the cold fortress, in the heavily secured room on the western side of the house, Jericho Crane sat perfectly still before his glowing surveillance screen and watched his wife play. He saw the shiny tears on her cheeks, saw her delicate shoulders trembling with quiet sobs, saw her fingers still moving flawlessly over the keys even as she cried. The golden hue of her music flooded through the speakers, wrapping tightly around his frozen heart. For 14 brutal months, Jericho had not cared whether anyone lived or died, wept or rejoiced. But tonight, as he watched the invisible woman pour her fractured soul into the music, Jericho Crane desperately wanted to know exactly why someone else was crying, and he fiercely wanted to be the one to wipe her tears away. A month had passed since the night Jericho first entered the dusty music room. They did not talk much, but the tense silence between them had slowly changed into something far gentler, like two weary strangers sharing the same small shelter in a freezing rainstorm. Then Eleanor Crane coldly announced that Jericho had to appear at the Crane Casino annual charity auction. It was the biggest event of the year, the night when Las Vegas high society gathered to proudly parade its vast wealth beneath a polished mask of fake generosity. For 14 months, Jericho had not appeared in public. People had whispered every vicious rumor imaginable, claiming he was dead, that he had gone completely mad, or that he was no longer capable of running his empire. Eleanor wanted those ugly rumors buried. Jericho did not want to go. Pearl could see his deep reluctance in the way he gripped the wheel of his chair, his jaw clenching tight as the muddy gray fog around him thickened more than usual. But he never refused his commanding mother, not because he was afraid, but because he was far too exhausted to fight her. That evening, Mina Santos helped Pearl prepare for the daunting event. She dressed Pearl in a stunning off-the-shoulder evening gown in deep turquoise, elegantly fitted through the bodice before softening gracefully from the hips down. For the very first time in her 27 years, Pearl wore something truly beautiful, something that actually fit her perfectly instead of squeezing her ribs or hanging loose like a shapeless sack. When Pearl came down into the grand hall, Jericho was already waiting. He wore a sharply tailored black three-piece suit, but his gray eyes were as dark as an approaching storm. He looked at Pearl for a very long moment, his gaze lingering on the vibrant turquoise fabric and the elegant sweep of her neck, and the muddy gray around him noticeably faded. When they arrived at the grand ballroom, the space blazed with blinding light. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the soaring ceiling, illuminating hundreds of elite guests. When Jericho Crane finally appeared in his matte black wheelchair, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing for one heavy second. Then the whispering began. Pearl heard every single word, not with her ears, but with her vivid colors. Gray streaks of morbid curiosity, green streaks of bitter envy, and pitch-black streaks of absolute contempt hidden safely beneath polished social smiles. "That is not Jasmine, is it?" Someone whispered nearby. "I heard Jasmine left him right after the accident. This heavy girl must be the desperate replacement." Those cruel voices were glossy black, a specific kind of cruelty disguised perfectly as upper-class politeness. Pearl did not react to the insults, but she noticed Jericho drinking his whiskey far too quickly. The muddy gray around him was growing thicker and heavier, threatening to swallow him whole. Eleanor paraded them through the crowd with a painfully false smile, but Pearl hardly listened to the introductions. She was entirely focused on Jericho. Then, she suddenly felt something completely different. A dark red. Not the pale red of ordinary fear or the bruised red of lingering hatred, but a dark red exactly like dried blood, a terrifying color signaling mortal danger coming from somewhere high above. Pearl quickly looked up, her sharp eyes sweeping frantically across the second-floor balcony and the tall glass windows. And then she saw it. A tiny red dot, almost too small for the human eye to catch, moving slowly and deliberately across the ballroom floor. A laser sight coming directly toward Jericho's chest. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. Pearl did not have time to think. She did not have time to scream a warning. She only acted on pure, desperate instinct, lunging violently toward Jericho and shoving both of her hands as hard as she could against his heavy wheelchair, sending it rolling wildly to one side. The sharp, deafening crack of a blast exploded through the air, violently slicing through the soft jaws. Music and the laughter. The deadly projectile tore through the exact space where Jericho had been sitting just a moment before, slamming into the wall behind him with a dry cracking sound. But Pearl could not completely avoid it. She felt something burning hot rip brutally through her left shoulder, a blinding pain erupting through her body like fire rapidly spreading through dry timber. She collapsed heavily to the cold marble floor, a dark crimson stain blooming quickly across her beautiful turquoise gown. Absolute chaos erupted instantly. People screamed in sheer terror, heavy tables overturned, and delicate champagne glasses shattered everywhere. Heavily armed security rushed in from every direction while Knox shouted frantic orders into his radio. Jericho looked at Pearl falling to the floor, staring in absolute horror at the spreading red essence soaking through her dress and her face growing terrifyingly pale from rapid blood loss. "Pearl," he shouted, his raw voice tearing through the deafening chaos. It was the very first time he had ever called her by her actual name. He desperately reached for her, but the wheelchair had been shoved too far away. "Bring her back to the estate," Jericho ordered, his voice as cold as ice, but trembling violently at the end. "My private doctor. No hospital. No one touches her except my doctor." When Knox tried to argue that she needed an emergency room, Jericho roared so loudly that the immediate area fell silent. When the medics carefully placed Pearl on the stretcher, Jericho reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold and pale, but he refused to let go. He held tightly onto her all the way back to the secure estate, saying absolutely nothing, only looking at her unconscious face. And for the very first time in 14 grueling months, Jericho Crane prayed for someone else's life. Pearl opened her heavy eyes and saw a ceiling washed in stark white. The throbbing pain in her left shoulder spread through her fragile body like a low fire burning beneath her skin, but it was not as agonizing as she had expected, likely because of the strong pain medication flowing through the intravenous line attached to her pale hand. She blinked several times, desperately trying to adjust her blurred vision to the soft light in the silent room. This was not her cold bedroom. This was the highly equipped medical facility hidden deep inside the Crane estate, complete with a stark white hospital bed, a steadily beeping heart monitor, and the sharp scent of antiseptic lingering heavily in the cold air. Then she saw him. Jericho Crane sat in his matte black wheelchair right beside her bed, still wearing the ruined black suit from the chaotic night before, the expensive fabric now wrinkled and marked with a few dried crimson stains of her own blood. His intense gray eyes were shadowed by deep dark circles. Rough stubble had begun to spread across his sharp jaw, and his ruined face carried the profound exhaustion of a desperate man who had not slept for a single second all night. He had not left her. She realized that with a quiet, undeniable surprise. From the terrifying moment she had collapsed on the ballroom floor until now, he had stayed right here beside her without moving away for even a single step. Jericho noticed that she was finally awake. His storm gray eyes fixed on her, and deep inside them was something Pearl had absolutely never seen before. Not the freezing coldness of a Mafia boss, not his usual bitter indifference, but raw worry, genuine fear, and perhaps even a deep anger tightly restrained. "Why did you do that?" he asked, his voice rougher and significantly lower than usual. It took Pearl a slow moment to fully understand what he meant. Then the terrifying memory rushed back. The red laser, the violent gunshot, the burning pain tearing through her shoulder. "I saw dark red," she answered weakly, her throat painfully dry. "I knew there was mortal danger." Jericho looked at her, his sharp jaw tightening so hard a muscle twitched in his scarred cheek. "You could have died." "I know." A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the sterile room. The heart monitor kept up its steady ticking, the absolute only sound in the stillness. Jericho looked at her as though she were a complex puzzle he could not solve. "Why?" he asked, his rough voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You do not owe me absolutely anything. You were brutally forced to marry me. You should hate me." Pearl thought for a long moment, carefully arranging the scattered thoughts in her mind that still felt blurred from the heavy medication. She did not know how to lie. She never had, so she simply told the absolute truth. "I do not hate you," she said softly. "Your voice does not carry a hateful color." Jericho did not speak. He only looked at her, his gray eyes deep and stormy like the winter sea, and Pearl saw that something profound was permanently changing inside him. The suffocating muddy gray was definitely still there, but it was thinning remarkably at the edges, slowly giving way to another vibrant color, the exact one she had glimpsed long before but had not been able to name. Then Jericho did something he had not done with absolutely anyone since the devastating car bomb. He reached out and gently took her pale hand. His large hand was incredibly warm and strong, but there was a faint tremor in his fingers that he simply could not hide. He held her small hand as though she might physically disappear if he ever let go. "Thank you," he said, his gravelly voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for not letting me die." And Pearl saw it clearly for the very first time. Turquoise. Brilliant, shimmering turquoise as bright as the vast ocean beneath the summer sunlight. It flowed beautifully from his voice, from that awkward but deeply sincere gratitude. It was the undeniable color of absolute truth, the color of real blossoming feeling. Still fragile and not yet fully formed. Your voice just changed color, Pearl whispered, a faint genuine smile touching her dry lips even while the deep ache in her shoulder still smoldered. I see it now. Jericho frowned slightly. What color? A beautiful one, she answered softly. A color I have never seen in you before. Jericho said nothing else, but he did not let go of her hand. They sat that way in comfortable silence, hand in hand, until Pearl drifted safely back to sleep beneath the heavy pull of the medication. A few days later, when Pearl's terrible wound had begun to heal and she was finally able to sit up against the pillows, Jericho was sitting in the adjacent study beside the medical room when his private phone suddenly rang. Knox handed the device to him with an expression of clear, undisguised irritation. The bright screen displayed the name Jasmine Whitmore. Jericho looked at the flashing name, his jaw locking tight. 14 months. 14 grueling months since the exact day she had fled the hospital weeping when the doctor clearly stated he might never walk again. 14 months of absolute cowardly silence, acting as though he had never existed in her glamorous life at all. He answered the call. Jericho. Jasmine's voice came through the speaker, as incredibly sweet as thick honey heavily laced with deadly poison. I heard you were brutally attacked. I was so incredibly worried. I want to see you. Jericho gave a cold, sharp laugh, a terrifying sound without even the smallest trace of warmth. 14 months of total silence, and now you are suddenly worried? Heavy silence stretched on the other end. Then Jasmine spoke again, her voice significantly lower now, carrying the fake practiced regret Jericho had heard far too many times in his violent life. I was terribly wrong. I know I was wrong, but I want to fix it. We can start over, Jericho. I still love you. I have a wife, Jericho replied coldly. Jasmine let out a mocking laugh, sharp and bright through the phone. Her? She is just the pathetic replacement, Jericho. Everybody in Las Vegas knows that. A heavy, useless girl my mother threw away because she was defective. Do you really think she is worthy of being your wife? Jericho was completely silent for a tense moment, and then he spoke, his voice as cold as winter frost. That replacement just took a deadly strike for me. The sniper shot was aimed directly at my head, and she threw herself completely in front of it. She almost died because of me. He stopped, deliberately letting the heavy words sink in. And what exactly did you do when I was lying in a sterile hospital bed, not knowing whether I would ever walk again? Oh, that is right. You ran. Complete silence met him on the other end. Jericho ended the call abruptly without waiting for an answer. In the quiet medical room, Pearl had heard absolutely everything. The thin wall between the two rooms was not very thick, and Jericho's deep voice was never small. She lay perfectly still on the white bed, looking up at the blank ceiling, and felt something incredibly warm and golden spreading completely through her chest that she could not quite name. He had chosen her, even if only in angry words, even if, in everyone else's judging eyes, she was still nothing but the unfortunate replacement. But in that defining moment, to the feared Jericho Crane, she was absolutely not the replacement. She was the brave woman who had taken a bullet for him, and that meant absolutely everything. A few minutes later, Jericho wheeled himself back into the medical room, Knox following quietly behind him. Jericho looked at Pearl for a long moment, completely choosing not to ask whether she had overheard the vicious call. She did not say anything either. Some profound things did not ever need to be spoken aloud. Increase the perimeter security, Jericho said strictly to Knox, his intense gray eyes never leaving Pearl's face. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Absolutely no one gets into this estate without my direct permission. Knox nodded firmly. And Miss Whitmore? Wherever she is, "That is exactly where I am," Jericho answered, his commanding voice allowing absolutely no argument. "She does not ever leave my sight." Pearl looked at the dangerous man sitting in the wheelchair, and for the very first time in 27 agonizing years, she felt fiercely protected. Not treated like a precious object to be possessed and locked away, but truly protected like a human being whose life finally had immense value. In the 4th month of their unusual marriage, on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the fragile piece of the Crane estate was violently shattered. Pearl was sitting quietly in the grand drawing room with Jericho, reading a book while he reviewed business files, when Nina Santos rushed in with wide, panicked eyes to announce unexpected visitors. She did not even have time to explain before the heavy double doors were pushed open and 2 deeply familiar figures walked in as though they owned the entire fortress. Jasmine led the way, wearing an expensive, skin-tight red dress that clung perfectly to her slender figure, her golden hair styled in flawless waves, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the imported marble floor. Constance Whitmore followed closely behind her favored daughter, draped in an elegant cream suit with heavy pearls rusting around her neck. A sickeningly false smile plastered across her face, as though she were arriving for a pleasant afternoon tea instead of barging into someone else's heavily guarded home. Pearl shot to her feet, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked over at Knox Mercer, who stood near the entrance with an unusually dark expression. When Pearl asked how they had bypassed the gate, Knox answered with a tight jaw that Eleanor Crane had directly given the security order to let them through. Pearl understood the bitter truth at once. The cold matriarch was still playing her cruel games, still desperately trying to get rid of Pearl and replace her with Jasmine, the conventionally perfect daughter-in-law she had originally chosen. "We came to visit our beloved daughter," Constance said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, but Pearl instantly saw the pitch-black color wrapped tightly around every single syllable. It was a suffocating darkness. Jasmine did not even bother to look at her older sister. She walked straight over to where Jericho sat in his wheelchair, her beautiful face blooming into a radiant, flawless smile as though her 14 months of absolute cowardly silence had never even happened. "Jericho," she purred, her voice as sweet as spun sugar. "I heard you are recovering so well. I am so incredibly happy." Pearl looked at the distinct color of Jasmine's voice and felt physically sick. It was a glossy black, exactly like toxic oil floating on the surface of dark water. It was a complete lie from beginning to end, entirely devoid of even the smallest trace of genuine human sincerity. Jericho looked up at Jasmine with gray eyes that were as cold and unforgiving as winter ice. He did not speak, he did not smile, and he showed absolutely zero pleasure at her sudden arrival. He only watched her in heavy silence, as though she were a repulsive insect crawling across his clean table. Constance stepped forward, smoothing her cream skirt, that false smile still lingering stubbornly on her painted lips. "Jericho, I think we should speak plainly," she stated, her voice adopting a fake tone of reasonable business. "This marriage was a strategic arrangement from the very beginning. Jasmine was the one originally chosen for you. Pearl was only ever a temporary substitute. Now that Jasmine is fully ready to come back to your side, we can arrange everything properly. Pearl can leave freely with a reasonable sum of money, and everyone benefits." A deadly silence filled the vast drawing room. Pearl stood frozen, watching her own flesh and blood betray her for the second time in her life, treating her exactly as though she were a defective product that could simply be returned to the store and exchanged for a much better one. She was deeply used to this horrible feeling. 27 years of it had made absolutely sure of that. But today, something inside her was entirely different. "I already have a wife," Jericho finally said, his deep voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. Jasmine let out a sharp, mocking laugh that rang harshly through the quiet space. "Her?" Jasmine sneered, finally turning to look at Pearl with undisguised contempt. She is just a pathetic replacement, Jericho. Everybody knows that. A heavy, useless girl nobody ever wanted. Do you really want to keep her instead of me? Pearl felt those cruel words attempting to cut into her flesh like familiar knives. But this time, she did not lower her head. She did not step back. She did not run and hide in the dark the way she had for the last 27 years. Instead, she calmly stepped forward and placed herself directly between Jasmine and Jericho. "Yes," Pearl said, her voice as perfectly calm as the surface of an autumn lake. "I am the replacement." Jasmine arched a perfect blonde eyebrow, a look of arrogant triumph flashing across her beautiful face, but Pearl was absolutely not finished. "But I am the replacement who actually took a bullet for him," Pearl continued, looking straight into Jasmine's stunned blue eyes. "The sniper's bullet was aimed directly at his head. I threw myself completely in front of it. I almost died on that ballroom floor. And where exactly were you?" A suffocating, deadly silence followed her words. The arrogant smile vanished instantly from Jasmine's glossy lips. "Oh, that is right," Pearl went on, her pale blue voice clear and undeniably steady, every single word cutting far deeper than any knife. "You ran away. The exact moment the hospital doctor said he might never walk again, you disappeared entirely. 14 months of absolute silence. Not one single phone call, not one single message, because you were terrified you would have to push your husband's wheelchair. You are terrified people would look at you with pity. You are terrified you would be dragged down into the dark with him." Jasmine turned completely pale, her mouth opening and closing, but absolutely no words came out. "I was not afraid," Pearl declared, her voice ringing clearly in the silent drawing room. "I did not run away, and I do not need you to give up anything for me, because you have absolutely nothing left to give up. You gave up your rightful place 14 months ago when you walked out of that hospital without looking back even once." Constance recovered from her shock and opened her mouth to angrily defend her golden child, but Jericho cut viciously across her. "Get out of my house," he commanded, his gravelly voice as cold as frozen glass. "Both of you, right this second, and do not ever come back." Constance gasped, pressing a hand to her pearls. "Jericho, you cannot possibly mean this." Jericho did not even grant her a second glance. "Knox," he said quietly, "show them out. And if they ever come anywhere near this estate or any Crane property ever again, make absolutely sure they understand the fatal consequences." Knox Mercer gave a sharp nod, stepped forward with heavy boots, and forcefully motioned for Constance and Jasmine to head toward the exit. The two arrogant Whitmore women were escorted out of the grand hall exactly like stray dogs being aggressively driven away from a royal feast. Jasmine turned back one final time to glare venomously at Pearl, her blue eyes filled with toxic hatred, but Pearl truly did not care. She had won. For the very first time in her entire life, she had bravely stood up for herself against her lifelong abusers, and she had won completely. When the heavy double doors finally slammed shut behind them, Pearl felt her legs tremble slightly beneath her dress. The massive rush of adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind physical exhaustion and a strange, quiet hollowness. She was just about to turn around and go back to her bedroom to rest when Jericho's voice stopped her in her tracks. "Pearl." She turned back to look at him. He was staring at her with an intense expression she had never seen before. It was not mere curiosity, and it was not the fragile gratitude from the hospital room. It was something far deeper, something incredibly warm and intensely overwhelming. "Tonight," he said, his voice thick with raw emotion. "Meet me in the music room. I need to tell you something." That night, Pearl sat at the grand Steinway piano without playing a single note. She only sat there in the heavy silence, looking down at the stark black and white keys, thinking deeply about absolutely everything that had happened that chaotic afternoon. The massive rush of adrenaline had long faded, leaving her to process the terrifying reality that she had finally fought back against her lifelong abusers and won. The heavy wooden door creaked open, breaking the stillness. Pearl turned her head. Jericho pushed himself into the dusty music room in his matte black wheelchair. But this time, he did not stop at the dark corner of the room the way he always had before. He rolled directly to the center of the space, stopping right in front of her. "I need to tell you something," he said, his gravelly voice incredibly rough and tense with an unspoken weight. Pearl looked at his sharp, scarred face and waited patiently in the dim moonlight. Then Jericho did something she absolutely never expected. He placed both of his large, strong hands firmly on the metal wheels of his chair. He gripped them so hard his scarred knuckles turned stark white, and then he slowly, agonizingly pushed his upper body forward. He was attempting to stand. His atrophied legs trembled violently under the sudden immense strain. His weak knees nearly gave way beneath his heavy frame. Beads of cold sweat broke rapidly across his pale forehead, but he stubbornly kept pushing, rising painfully from the wheelchair on his own 2 feet. Pearl sprang to her feet instantly, her heart leaping violently into her throat, about to rush forward to steady him before he collapsed. "Do not," Jericho commanded softly, his deep voice catching with the immense physical effort. "I want to stand when I say this to you." He stood there in the center of the quiet room, his legs shaking exactly like fragile leaves in a violent winter storm, his tall body swaying dangerously, but he miraculously remained completely upright. His storm-gray eyes looked straight into her blue-gray ones, and inside his intense gaze was something Pearl had never seen in absolutely anyone's eyes before when they looked at her. "Pearl," he said, each single word pulled painfully from deep inside his aching chest. "I love you." Absolute silence filled the dusty air. "I do not know exactly when it started," he continued, his deep voice trembling slightly, but remaining incredibly steady with absolute conviction. "Maybe it was the exact moment you bravely told me my voice was muddy gray. Maybe it was when you played this piano in the dead of night and I listened through the security cameras like a desperate thief. Maybe it was when you stepped directly into the line of fire for me without a single hesitation. I love you, Pearl, and I desperately want you to stay. Not because of a cold business contract, not because of my cruel mother, and not because of anyone else, but because I truly want you." His weak legs finally gave out. Pearl rushed forward with a quiet gasp and caught his heavy frame just before he hit the hardwood floor. They sank to the ground together, Jericho resting securely in her arms, breathing very hard from the overwhelming exhaustion of his effort. He tipped his head back to look at her, sweat damp across his brow, but his gray eyes were shining brighter than they ever had before. "What color is my voice now?" he asked, still breathing fast, searching her face for the truth she always carried. Pearl looked down at the feared Mafia boss rusting in her lap, and she saw it more clearly than anything else in her entire 27 years. There was absolutely no more muddy gray, no more suffocating fog of dark depression, but brilliant, radiant gold touched beautifully with shimmering turquoise, exactly like the vast ocean shimmering under the midday summer sunlight. "Gold," she answered, a genuine, beautiful smile blooming across her lips while warm tears pricked her eyes. "With a little turquoise." "What exactly does that mean?" Jericho asked softly. "It means you are telling the absolute truth," she whispered back, "and you are terrified of losing me." Jericho laughed, a real, warm laugh, the very first genuine one since the devastating bomb had stolen his life 14 months ago. It came out rough and uneven from not having been used in so long, but it was incredibly real. "I am very afraid," he admitted honestly, exposing his heavily guarded heart. Pearl gently touched his face, her slender fingers brushing lightly over the old, jagged scar on his left cheek. "Do not be afraid," she said gently. "I am not going anywhere." Then she bent down and kissed him, softly, slowly, as though they had their entire lives to do this. And in that defining moment, Pearl braced herself, but she did not hear the agonizing sound of breaking glass. There was absolutely no pain, no fear, only the vibrant, glorious color of warm honey flooding her entire vision, as bright and gentle as early summer sunlight. For the very first time in her life, Pearl Whitmore truly knew what it felt like to be loved. 2 months after their unforgettable first kiss in the dusty music room, absolutely everything in Pearl's world had fundamentally changed. She no longer slept entirely alone in the freezing, cavernous bedroom in the isolated eastern wing of the heavily guarded estate. She had bravely moved her few belongings into Jericho's private sanctuary, choosing to lie peacefully beside him each and every night, listening to the deep, steady sound of his breathing in the comforting dark. They did not rush their delicate intimacy. Jericho profoundly understood her highly unusual gift, perfectly comprehending the terrifying sound of shattering glass she heard whenever someone touched her without genuine love, and he waited with infinite patience, letting her traumatized mind grow, completely used to their new closeness, letting her fragile heart truly believe that every single time his strong hands touched her, it came from a place of real, undeniable love. Pearl no longer heard the agonizing sound of broken glass. There was only the vibrant, warm honey gold light that surrounded her entirely whenever he was near. On a bright afternoon near the very end of their mandated 6-month timeline, an unexpected guest arrived at the fortress. It was Madame Lorraine, a highly esteemed music producer who had finally listened to the secret cassette tapes Gerald Whitmore had faithfully sent her for 10 long years. Madame Lorraine sat in the formal drawing room, her sharp eyes shining with a rare, genuine excitement that Pearl had never seen directed at her before. "I have incredibly good news for you," Pearl, the elegant woman said, her cultured voice manifesting as a bright, optimistic silver in Pearl's vision. "I have officially arranged a private audition for you in Manhattan, directly before the senior judging panel at Carnegie Hall." Pearl rose to her feet at once, her chest heaving as her heart began pounding wildly against her ribs. Carnegie Hall. It was the absolute holy ground of classical music that every single pianist on earth desperately dreamed of entering, the sacred stage where historical legends had performed, where the celebrated careers of the greatest artists in the world had been miraculously born. "If you pass this rigorous audition," Madame Lorraine continued, her silver voice turning intensely solemn, "you will perform your original composition at the Grand Spring Concert before 3,000 people. This is the exact kind of miraculous opportunity most talented artists spend an entire lifetime waiting for." Pearl looked over at Jericho, who was sitting right beside her on the plush velvet sofa, his large hand clasped safely around hers. He smiled deeply, and a warm golden streak spread beautifully through his gravelly voice when he spoke. "I will go with you." Pearl was genuinely startled. He had not left the safety of Las Vegas since the devastating car bomb had shattered his life. "Jericho," she whispered, squeezing his warm hand. "You absolutely do not have to do that." "I want to go," he cut in, his voice incredibly firm and leaving no room for argument. "I will absolutely not miss this defining moment for you." They flew to New York City exactly 1 week before the scheduled audition. Jericho was remarkably able to walk with a heavy wooden cane now, though he was still quite slow and occasionally in visible pain. 6 grueling months of relentless physical therapy, 6 months of pure, stubborn determination not to give up on his shattered body, had miraculously helped him rise from the confines of his wheelchair. He still brought the matte black wheelchair along for the difficult times when the physical exhaustion hit him too hard, but most of the time, he fiercely insisted on walking on his own 2 legs. They stayed in an absurdly luxurious hotel in the heart of Manhattan, a sprawling penthouse suite featuring tall windows overlooking the vast green expanse of Central Park. Pearl spent the vast majority of her precious time practicing, sitting at the pristine grand piano provided in their suite, playing the emotional piece she would perform over and over again until every single complex note flowed from her fingertips as naturally as breathing. The beautiful music filled the New York penthouse with swirling colors of gold, turquoise, and violet, drowning out the chaotic traffic noise from the busy city streets far below. On the tense night right before the terrifying audition, she practiced until it was very late, her fingers flying across the keys in a frantic, desperate rhythm, until Jericho finally stepped up behind her and gently pulled her away from the instrument. "You need to rest your hands," he said softly, pressing a warm kiss to the crown of her head. "Tomorrow is the most important day of your life." Pearl nodded silently, but when she finally climbed into the massive hotel bed, she found that she absolutely could not sleep. She lay perfectly still in Jericho's strong arms, staring up at the unfamiliar ceiling in the heavy darkness, thinking about absolutely everything that had miraculously led her to this very moment. 27 years shut inside a house of darkness. 27 years of being repeatedly told she was heavy, ugly, and entirely useless. And now, against all impossible odds, she was about to stand on the legendary stage of Carnegie Hall. The very next day, exactly 1 hour before the life-changing audition was scheduled to begin, Pearl sat quietly in a small, private backstage room of the legendary hall. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and ancient wood, thick with the heavy weight of musical history. She wore an elegant, understated black evening gown, her hair pinned up carefully to keep it out of her face, her makeup soft and natural. Nina Santos had flown all the way to New York to help her get ready, and the kind housekeeper had just stepped out into the busy corridor to bring Pearl some fresh water. Jericho sat right beside Pearl on a small velvet sofa, his warm hand holding hers, calming her racing heart with his steady, quiet presence. His storm gray eyes were softer than usual, radiating a quiet, protective pride. A soft knock sounded at the heavy wooden door. Before either of them could speak, a server pushed the door open, rolling a small metal cart carrying a steaming porcelain teapot and porcelain cups into the room. "Hot tea from the organizers, ma'am," the server said softly, keeping her face lowered as though trying not to be seen, her voice muffled by the high collar of her uniform. "To help you relax before your performance." Pearl politely thanked her and reached out her right hand toward the cart to accept a cup. Because she was so incredibly distracted by her nervous heartbeat and the magnitude of the upcoming audition, Pearl did not look closely at the server. She did not notice the cheap brown wig desperately attempting to hide familiar golden blonde hair. She did not see the hateful blue eyes shining with absolute malice beneath layers of heavy, unfamiliar makeup. Most tragically, Pearl did not immediately process the pitch black, toxic color wrapping around the server's muffled words until it was exactly 1 second too late. Everything horrifying happened in a fraction of an instant. The disguised server suddenly lunged forward, intentionally catching her shoe on the thick leg of a nearby chair, and violently tipped the heavy porcelain teapot forward. Boiling, scalding water spilled directly onto Pearl's unprotected right hand. Pearl screamed. Agonizing pain exploded through her flesh like liquid fire, feeling exactly like thousands of burning needles driving violently through her sensitive skin. The boiling liquid poured relentlessly over her dominant hand, over the vital fingers she absolutely needed to play, completely washing away her future in a terrifying wave of heat. Absolute chaos erupted instantly in the cramped backstage room. Pearl collapsed against the sofa, clutching her wrist as the skin immediately began to redden and blister. Jericho lunged violently toward her, completely forgetting his heavy wooden cane, his weak legs nearly giving way, but sheer panic keeping him upright until he reached her side. "Pearl," he shouted, raw terror tearing viciously through his deep voice. "Pearl." He grabbed a coal cloth from the cart and pressed it gently over her burning skin, bellowing furiously for someone to find a doctor. In the sudden, deafening chaos of security guards rushing into the room and staff members shouting in panic, absolutely no one noticed that the disguised server had slipped quietly out of the open door like a cowardly shadow. But the advanced security cameras monitoring the whole way caught absolutely everything. When Knox Mercer reviewed the digital footage just a few hours later, he recognized the attacker immediately. That malicious server, hiding beneath the brown wig and the heavy makeup, was none other than Jasmine Whitmore. Constance and Jasmine had ruthlessly followed them all the way to New York City. They had known all about the prestigious audition, and they had viciously planned to destroy Pearl's one chance at happiness from the very beginning. Within minutes, the theater doctor rushed into the room, his face growing exceptionally grim as he carefully assessed the severe damage to her hand. "These are bad second-degree burns," the doctor said, his professional voice low and incredibly heavy with regret. "The skin is already blistering rapidly, and in some tender places, it has already begun to peel away. Her fingers are far too badly swollen." Pearl looked down at her bandaged, throbbing hand, hot tears sliding silently down her pale cheeks. She was not crying because of the terrible physical pain, but because she knew exactly what devastating verdict was coming next. She absolutely should not play today, the doctor firmly told Jericho, who stood rigidly beside the sofa with a face completely drained of all color, looking as though he wanted to murder someone. If she attempts to strike those heavy keys, the immense strain on her damaged fingers could cause permanent nerve damage. She could completely lose the fine movement of her right hand forever. For a dedicated pianist, that is an absolute life sentence. Pearl closed her eyes tightly, the bitter tears falling without end. 6 grueling months of intense preparation, 27 years of desperate waiting in the dark. The ultimate dream of playing at Carnegie Hall had been right in front of her, close enough to finally touch, and now it had been violently dissolved into nothing but smoke and ashes because of one single pot of boiling water. Her own flesh and blood had crossed the country just to ensure she remained a broken, useless thing. Jericho knelt painfully beside her, ignoring the sharp ache in his own ruined knees, his large hand trembling as he gently took her uninjured left hand in his. He did not say anything. He only stayed there in the heavy silence, letting her know she was not entirely alone in her devastating grief. But Pearl knew the tragic truth. No matter how many times he stayed by her side, no matter how deeply and fiercely he loved her, he could not play the piano for her. He could not live her ultimate dream in her place. This was her battle to fight alone, and as she stared at her throbbing, ruined fingers, she felt as though she had already lost everything. 30 minutes before the life-changing audition, Pearl sat quietly in the small backstage room, looking down at her heavily bandaged right hand. White medical gauze was wrapped tightly around her swollen fingers, leaving only the reddened, blistering tips exposed beneath a thick layer of glossy burn ointment. The agonizing pain throbbed like a small, relentless fire burning just beneath her fragile skin, a cruel physical reminder of exactly what had just happened, of exactly what she was about to lose. Jericho knelt carefully in front of her, setting his wooden cane on the floor, his storm-gray eyes completely full of raw worry as he looked at her without blinking. "You absolutely do not have to do this," he said, his gravelly voice incredibly gentle but deeply serious. "There will be other chances, Pearl. Your injured hand desperately needs time to heal. No one will blame you if you do not play today." Pearl did not answer right away. She looked at her bandaged hand, looking at the delicate fingers that had once moved across piano keys like running water, now painfully swollen and throbbing with pure agony. She thought about absolutely everything that had brought her to this exact moment in time. 27 years, she began, her pale blue voice low and incredibly slow. "All my life, my mother told me I was heavy, ugly, and entirely useless. All my life, I gave up because of the cruel things she said. She strictly forbade me to play the piano, and I stopped. She locked me away in a dark attic, and I stayed there. She forced me to marry a dangerous Mafia boss, and I agreed." Pearl lifted her head, her blue-gray eyes rimmed with angry red, but shining with a fierce, untamed determination Jericho had absolutely never seen in her before. "Today, for the very first time in my entire life, I am not going to give up because of her," Pearl declared, each single word sounding as though it had been carved deep into heavy stone. She and Jasmine flew all the way across the country to New York just to violently destroy my one dream. If I give up today, they finally win. If I do not walk out onto that stage right now, then 27 years of living in suffocating darkness will not have meant anything at all. Jericho looked at her, looking deep into her brave eyes, and saw something fundamentally changing there. This was absolutely not the timid, broken girl he had met 6 months ago in that freezing penthouse. This was a magnificent woman rising to her own feet, furiously reclaiming her stolen life, entirely refusing to be defeated. "Your injured hand," he whispered, his golden voice full of heavy concern. "It is still here," Pearl answered firmly, looking down at the white medical bandages. "I still have 10 fingers. I am going to play, even if it hurts me. Even if it is not perfect, I am going to play." Jericho was completely silent for a long, defining moment. Then he stood up, moving slowly and painfully because of his aching knees, but with absolute, unwavering resolve. He gripped his wooden cane tightly, looked at her with gray eyes burning incredibly bright, and said, "Then play. I will be sitting right in the front row." Exactly 15 minutes later, Pearl stepped out onto the legendary stage. The blinding spotlight poured down on her, so intensely bright that for the first few seconds, she could barely see anything at all in the massive auditorium. Then her vision adjusted, and she saw them. The senior judging panel sat in the center rows of the otherwise empty hall, 5 esteemed judges in formal attire, their expressions entirely serious and impossible to read. And in the very front row, right below the edge of the stage, Jericho Crane was there. When she stepped out into the light, he rose to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane, a silent act of fierce, undeniable encouragement. A confused murmur spread across the judging table when they noticed the thick white bandages wrapped around Pearl's right hand. She vividly heard the gray streaks of their sudden surprise, the pale red of their rising doubt. A pianist with a severely bandaged hand? Is she completely out of her mind? Pearl truly did not care. She walked directly to the glossy black grand piano in the center of the stage and sat down on the leather bench, carefully adjusting her posture. She looked down at the keys, black and white sitting side by side like day and night, like blinding pain and profound hope, like absolutely everything she had lived through in her 27 years. She took a deep, shaky breath. Then she placed her injured hands on the cold keys and began to play. The very first notes trembled. Her right hand hurt so terribly she wanted to scream out loud, every single press of a key sending violent, searing fire shooting up her arm and directly into her shoulder. She missed one note, then 2. The required rhythm faltered, slower and significantly less steady than usual. But she stubbornly kept going. She thought of her father, of 10 long years spent secretly recording her music in the dark. She thought of Madame Lorraine, who had genuinely believed in her talent before anyone else ever did. She thought of Jericho, the dangerous man standing in the front row, the man who had loved her when she had been absolutely nothing at all. And then the beautiful music truly began to flow. It was not technically perfect. There were painful stumbles. There were slightly wrong notes. There were moments of desperate hesitation when the physical agony simply became far too much to bear. But this was absolutely not a performance about flawless technique. This was a fractured soul finally singing. Every single note carried 27 years of being locked in total darkness. Every melody vividly told the tragic story of a girl called heavy, ugly, and useless, who still never once stopped dreaming. Every complex chord was the desperate cry of a heavy heart that had once been crushed but entirely refused to stop beating. Pearl played the piece she had composed herself, a masterpiece about the vibrant colors of sound, about the pitch black of wicked lies and the brilliant turquoise of absolute truth, about the muddy gray of crushing despair and the warm honey gold of sincere love. She played with absolutely everything she possessed, with blinding pain and immense joy, with hot tears and fragile smiles, with her entire, beautifully ruined soul. When the final, echoing note rang out and slowly dissolved into the still air, Pearl sat completely frozen, her right hand trembling so violently from the severe pain that she could no longer control it. She did not dare look up. She was terrified to see rejection on the judges' faces. She was terrified that everything she had sacrificed still would not be enough. Absolute silence stretched over the massive auditorium. The heavy silence stretched so long that Pearl thought her own racing heart might simply stop beating. Then, sudden applause broke out. One person, two, three, and then the entire panel rose to their feet. Thunderous applause rolled over her like a massive wave, like the whole world was loudly telling her she had finally done it. Pearl looked up, wet tears blurring her vision, and saw Jericho standing in the front row, his gray eyes shining with absolute, undeniable pride. The flight from New York back to Las Vegas lasted 5 hours, but to Pearl, it felt as though she had only rested her eyes for a single moment. She slept deeply through the journey, her head resting peacefully on Jericho's broad shoulder, her bandaged right hand lying lightly in her lap. The pain was still there, smoldering beneath the heavy medication, but it absolutely no longer mattered because Carnegie Hall had officially accepted her for the grand spring concert. By the time their private car arrived back at the heavily guarded Crane estate, night had already fallen across the desert. Knox Mercer opened the car door, his face far more serious than usual as he quietly reported that the conspirators had been captured and were waiting in the grand drawing room. Pearl stepped into the massive hall, physically exhausted but radiantly happy, and froze where she stood. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, stood right in the middle of the room, his back straighter than she had ever seen before. The deep weakness she used to see in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by the unbreakable resolve of a man who had finally made the most important decision of his life. Pearl ran to him and threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly as warm tears spilled over her cheeks. Jericho stood right behind them, leaning steadily on his wooden cane, watching the beautiful reunion in respectful silence. Then his storm-gray eyes turned as cold as winter ice. "Bring them in," he ordered. A few minutes later, Constance and Jasmine were forcefully escorted into the drawing room by armed security. They no longer looked proud and arrogant. Jasmine's expensive clothes were wrinkled, and Constance's eyes filled with sudden panic when she saw Gerald standing there with an unreadable expression. Knox stepped forward and placed a laptop on the table, pressing play. Crystal-clear security footage from the New York theater filled the glowing screen, undeniably showing Jasmine in her disguised uniform deliberately pouring the boiling tea onto Pearl's hand. Constance tried to deny it, her voice shrill and desperate, but Gerald stepped forward and silenced his cruel wife forever. 27 years, Gerald said, every single word cutting like a sharpened blade. For 27 years, I watched you treat my beautiful daughter like trash, and I stayed silent because I was a coward. But today, I stop. He looked straight into Constance's horrified eyes. Pearl is absolutely not ugly, and she is absolutely not useless. I am leaving you, Constance. Pearl stood beside her father, looking at the woman who had cursed her for her entire life. I see the colors of truth, Mother, Pearl said softly. And your color has always been pitch black. I thought it was the only color meant for me, but I was so incredibly wrong. Jericho stepped forward, his deep voice leaving no room for any mercy. You and Jasmine will leave Las Vegas within 48 hours, he commanded. I will use every single piece of influence I possess to make absolutely sure no one will ever hire you. No one will do business with you, and no one will even greet you on the street. You will become completely invisible. The two ruined women were dragged away, their arrogant faces drained of all color. Then Jericho summoned his own mother. Eleanor Crane walked in with her back straight, but Jericho verbally dismantled her just as ruthlessly. He revealed that he knew she had allowed the car bomb plot to happen to maintain her own grip on the family empire. You will live in the isolated house on the outskirts, Jericho told his pale mother. You will have absolutely no authority in Crane Holdings, and when I have children, you will never be allowed to meet them. It was the harshest punishment possible, and Eleanor walked out in absolute, defeated silence. Over the next few months, Jericho completely changed his life. He systematically dismantled every single illegal operation and turned his vast underworld empire into a fully legitimate business, softly telling Pearl that he desperately wanted to live long enough to watch their future children grow old. When spring finally arrived, Pearl stood behind the heavy velvet curtain at Carnegie Hall, her heart pounding like war drums. 3,000 people were seated in the massive auditorium, waiting just for her. The pink scar on her right hand was fully healed, a proud physical proof of her incredible survival. The bright stage lights came alive, and Pearl stepped out in a breathtaking black gown, walking like a queen into her rightful kingdom. She sat at the glossy grand piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The beautiful piece she had composed, Colors of Truth, poured gloriously through the hall. In her eyes, the air filled with vibrant turquoise, honey gold, and starlit silver, weaving together into a living masterpiece. When the final, triumphant chord faded into the absolute stillness, 3,000 people rose to their feet in a thunderous, roaring wave of applause. Pearl looked down at the front row with tears streaming down her face, and she saw Jericho walking slowly toward the stage. He was not in his wheelchair. He was not using his wooden cane. He climbed the short steps on his own 2 feet, walking to her with absolute strength. He pulled her into his arms right in front of the entire cheering world. "What color is my voice now?" he whispered against her hair. "Honey gold," she answered, a beautiful smile lifting her lips. "It means you are truly in love." And as the roaring applause washed over them, Pearl knew she would never live in the dark ever again. Thank you all so much for listening to this Sunni romance story. Which beautiful moment touched your heart the most, and did you cheer when Pearl finally stood up to her cruel family? Please let me know in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe and like this video so we can keep bringing you more deeply emotional stories just like this one. We wish you immense joy, profound peace, and true love in your own life. See you in the next video.